Hello. Okay, so today I want to talk about systemic racisms. I am making it plural. I will explain why I am making it plural because there's more than one basically. In fact, the whole idea that we are a racist nation and always have been a racist nation is itself a result of a system teaching racism. Now, to address that fact, we have the 10th Amendment of the United States, which says, anything not covered by the Constitution, it is the state's rights to govern. And this is something we seem to forget. And so, people who want to say the United States was a racist country all along, well, what about, back in the 1820s, this could happen? Well, yes, it could in a certain state because they made laws that allowed it to happen. It didn't happen in the rest of the nation, usually. Now, there were racists that exist, and they would sometimes borrow racist ideas from other states. So some of these, yes, there was some spill over between states and racism. But to turn around and say, aha, this happened in Alabama back in 1820, and therefore it happened in the entire United States, is itself wrong. In fact, it's something that, systemic racists try to use to say all of the United States was a racist nation. I mean, the whole idea of the Civil War came around because we had different laws in different states regarding slavery. And I talked about that a little in past videos and how that was more of a property rights issue than a racism issue. And yes, people as property is a horrible thing, but it was the law throughout the civilized world for thousands of years. So to say, it's suddenly more wrong because it's happening in the United States is itself wrong. And we finally did away with it. But we get no credit for doing away with it. We weren't the first nation to do away with it, but we were one of the first. So that is one thing. It is systemically racist to turn around and try to say the entire history of the United States is racist based on what a few states were doing. It's bad history too. So actually, the federal government really didn't get into race until the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It sort of gave everyone citizenship if they were born here, except for United States, Native Americans, because they had a different writing of the Constitution. It gave you the right to own property, and gave you the right to appeal in court, make court appeals and such. So, basic rights. Skip forward to the Civil Rights Act of 1871. That was basically against the KKK. Certain people who like to dress as ghosts were doing things wrong. Some of them were high up in government, in your local government at least. And so there was a lot of misjudgments made. And so Civil Rights Act of 1871 was like, you can actually sue government officials and such based on the fact that they dressed as ghosts and harassed you because some of the activities were simmering down, but there was still a lot of racism going on. I might not take you to a necktie party, but I will give you a traffic ticket, type of thing. And so if you can prove That's the important thing of all the Civil Rights Act is you still have to prove something went wrong, which some racists will want to step out and say, well, that itself is racist. And I would say no. It's just because some people are doing bad things, you can't say all people of that skin color are doing bad things, which is what people are trying to do today. There's your systemic racism. All white people are racists. No, no, all the Civil Rights Acts, you weren't allowed to just say, I'm black, he's right. The Civil Rights Act gives me an advantage over him. It is no, I'm black, he's right, I have proof that he did this wrong against me, I want to take him to court. And so we're skipping over that with some modern day stuff that's going on because modern day people are systemically racist too. It's just a different system. That's sort of more or less where I'm going with this video when I say systemic racism is plural, is there are several different systems which are inviting racism in. And they are by different groups. And these groups are of different races. It's not to say all people of one race are behind any one of these systems, but some of the systems themselves are racist or are driven by race, a specific race. And all of them are equally wrong. There's a thing no one wants to discuss is, if you want equality, you have to condemn all of them. Okay, jump ahead, 1875, and so basically the rights for use of inns in public transportation. You can't discriminate. People sometimes had to travel for work, go out of town, they need a place to stay. So, you can't refuse them, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you need a job for those sometimes. And so you can't just say, well, I don't want someone of this race in my hotel room. Well, no, he has a right to have a job, and to hold that job, he might have had to travel from out of state. It wasn't unusual for people to go out of town for a week to work and leave their family back in their home. It's just a matter of that's where the work is, that's where you have to go. So it wasn't abandoning your family, it was just a matter of, if I want to support my family, I have to leave town from time to time to get a job. And so 1875 Civil Rights Act made it more feasible for people to do that. Let's see, 1957, we're skipping ahead a lot. Basically voting discrimination. Which, you would think the 1866 one, allowing access to courts, would have made voting more stable. I guess don't know if that's the right word, but apparently it didn't. So 1957, they finally came down and said, okay, we're going to make specific rules for voting to make sure that individual states or individual things aren't using loopholes to prevent people from voting. 1864, that's sort of the big one everyone knows about. It ended segregation. So, equal access to schools, other such things. 1868, back to, the 1866 one allowed for you to own property, but again, people were using loopholes or whatever to not sell property. And so the 1868 Civil Rights Act, you can't discriminate in the sale or rental of property based on race. People were still looking for these loopholes in the law, so we needed a law to close the loopholes. And then 1991, that was basically more clarification and strengthening of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That's the federal government getting in on race issues, basically. Now, some people are going to say, what about the 3/5 compromise? And the Three-Fifths Compromise deserves its own video, basically. It doesn't say what everyone says it says, or that was not the intent behind it, at least. People bent the meaning. But we used to have civics classes which went into more detail and that sort of thing, and we don't now. And so a bunch of systemic racists got in on the education system and started spreading these myths about how certain laws worked and how they were always intended to make us a racist nation. Okay, so back in the 70s when I was growing up, everyone admitted racism existed. I mean, we weren't that foolish. It was obvious. Now, if you ask people, have things improved any? Most people would say, well, yeah, things are better now than they were in the 50s. Because 50s were bad. That's why one of the reasons we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act was things were pretty bad in the 50s. Now, ask someone growing up in the 50s, was it as bad as the late 1800s? They would say, no, things have gotten better. And others would say things have gotten better since slavery. Which there are some historians who will say that being black in America after the Civil War there was actually a step forward. And we needed people to work. Black people were willing to work. You just had to pay them now. And so there are some historians, I've seen people write papers about how, there was a step forward for civil rights after the Civil War, even without all these laws, just out of necessity. Now, how accurate are those? I don't know. That would be, again, a lot more research into them and a lot more reading of counter arguments to them. But some people have made that argument. But around 2000, late 1990s, 2000s, there was a poll done of young black people, teenagers mainly, asking, have things improved since the Civil War? And over 50% said no. Things are just as bad now as they were in the Civil War. Despite the fact, again, back in the 70s, you talk to an elderly black person who lived through the 50s, and they will say, yes, things have gotten better. And again, if they talk to their grandparents, they'd say things got better since, the turn of the 20th century. So why is it? Why do we suddenly have all these teenagers saying that things haven't improved at all over 200 years? And that is because we've got groups of racists telling them that it hasn't. Different systems of racism have encouraged them to believe that things are just as bad now as they were 200 years, or 175 roughly years ago, close to 200 years. That's systemic racism telling them that. I saw an interview. A black woman, she does talks to black children, tries to encourage them to do good, or to work to get ahead. And talked to one child, and he's saying he wanted to join the Air Force, but there's no way the white man would allow him to fly a plane, or at least not in the Air Force. Now, this after 30 years of hearing about Tuskegee Airmen. Now, again, when I was a child, almost no one heard of the Tuskegee Airmen. It wasn't until like the late 80s, I think PBS did a documentary on them. And then after that, every February, Black History Month, we would hear about the Tuskegee Airmen. Yet despite that, we have this young black man believing that he can't be a pilot in the Air Force. Why? Because some group of people told him, don't even bother trying. And this is the big problem with the modern day systemic racist. We have groups telling young black people, don't bother even trying, whitey won't let you do it. And that's causing more trouble than anything else. So, like I said, there are many different systems of racism. Some of them are black systems, others are white systems. But, so far, just looking at the attitude of young people growing up, there are a lot of black systems causing systemic racism right now. They're being told, don't trust the white man, don't bother trying because the white man won't allow you to succeed. And that's the bigger problem we're having right now, is people are being told, don't bother even trying. So, again, some of this goes to education, where we have people are telling alternate versions of what's going on. So education has its systemic racists within it, telling them don't bother trying. If you want to go to the Air Force Academy, which they have their own, you're going to have to learn math, because if your guidance system goes out, computer system goes out, you're going to have to do some quick calculations. So they're going to make you learn math. You've got to learn to communicate, because you're in the military. Communication's important. So you can talk your ebonics, the Zoomers can talk their skibbity Zoomer talk to each other. But when you're talking to someone who might be writing you an reference because you want to enter the Air Force Academy, you got to learn to speak proper English well. And you don't have to know the difference between who and whom, but you've got to speak well enough for them to say, yes, this guy can communicate and therefore can work with the military. And that goes for most colleges, not just the military ones. There's still some expectation of communication. Okay, let's see what else we got going here. So people have been told not to try. Black Lives Matter, which is supposed to be fighting racism, is, in my opinion, a systemic racist organization. That's my, they couldn't say anything. When the organization first formed, and we got to differentiate between the organization Black Lives Matter and the slogan Black Lives Matter, because the slogan, there's nothing wrong with the slogan. We were at a point in history where we had to look more closely at things that were going on, and yes, the slogan I have no problem with, but then someone decided to form an organization based on the slogan, and every time they were on making a public statement, they were making racist statements. And yes, you can be racist if you are black. I've discussed that before. Or my counter argument is, because it is, what is it? Prejudice with power. Racism is prejudice with power, and black people have no power, so they can't be racist. Black Lives Matter has more power than I ever had in my lifetime, so therefore either I'm not racist or they are. If you want to call me a racist, you got to call them a racist. I said that in a past video. I'm going to repeat it. I will probably say it in future videos as well. So, again, we have these organizations who, interestingly enough, they were more interested in their own well-being than in the well-being of their race. In that, very shortly after they formed, there were allegations of money being misspent and people getting rich off of the organization, which for the past 3 or 4 years, these allegations have been around, and there have really been no arguments to the contrary. Some of them are, in court cases now. So again, we have a system which is using racism to enrich the members of the system, as opposed to help the people they're claiming they're here to help. On the surface, it looks like that, at least. Like I said, I will throw in the word allegedly, just because, proof of that would be another thing altogether, and I'm not going to, other people have been trying to prove it better than I could. Now, of course, Black Lives Matter started with police overstepping their authority, racist cops or supposedly racist cops. Some of them, stories are coming up where they weren't necessarily as racist. Um, Another thing to look at. So, you don't know what it's like to have police stare at you. I've heard this said by many black people who have not had the police stare at them as much as they want to claim. Now, take it from someone who, middle-aged, single white guy with a beard. This is the profile of a domestic terrorist. So you want to tell me I haven't had the police or authorities, federal authorities look at me because of the way I look? I can tell you, after 9/11, just about every time I went through the airport, I was more likely to be pulled aside for extra security than other people there. In fact, I would bet that I've been pulled aside for extra security more often than some of these black men have had police stare at them. Now, again, we have a bunch of young children told the police are looking at you more, and they're just assuming it's true. And that is, again, a system of a system of racism, this time, again, mainly supported by black people, have told them, don't trust Whitey. But again, I get looked at. Maybe not as often. Now, the police, they will do their pre-shift meeting or whatever, and they will discuss what crimes have happened in the last 24 hours. And so if the majority of the crimes, the witnesses have said we saw a black man running away, and here's the very vague description we had, because let's be honest, we get vague descriptions or vague video images or whatever. So the police are going to look at black people more closely than white people, just because the majority of the people who they've been told to look for, not because they're racist, but because this is what witnesses have told them, were black. And again, vague descriptions, so they have to look at them a little more closely than they would other people. They are not looking at you because they suspect you, they are looking at you to try to rule you out, rather than just pulling you over because you're black and because a black person did whatever last night. So yes, them looking at you is trying to avoid racism, not trying to be racist in most of these cases. There can still be racist police officers, and so that is something to watch for, but assuming that they are all racist is something systemic racists have foisted on society. Okay, so speaking of crime statistics, so you will have a lot of white racists will come out and say 60% of crimes are committed by black people who are only 20% of the population. That might be a slightly outdated statistic. This is what I heard growing up most of the time. It's probably out of date now. Percentages have changed. And people arguing systemic racism is bad will turn around and they will say, well, that's systemic racism forcing black people to commit crimes because they have no other choice. And what no one will point out is that same people who tabulate these statistics will also tell you that only about 5% of black people are criminals. 95% don't commit crimes. 5% of black people, which would be about 1% of the population, are committing this 60% of crimes. So, my question to the white racists is, if black people are so racist, then how come only 5% of them are committing crimes? And my question to the black racists who want to say that systemic racism is driving this on, why are 95% of black people not criminals? If this is systemic racism driving on the crime rate, I would expect at least 15 to 20%, probably more, of black people to be criminals, and statistically speaking, they aren't. So it is just as racist to turn around and say systemic racism is what's causing 60% of crimes to be carried out by 1% of the population, essentially, which is 5% of the black people. You can't blame systemic racism when you start looking at the real numbers. Okay, now the mainstream media is one for pushing this, and so they are, again, a system of racists who are pushing racism. We can jump back to the 90s again. Black churches are being burned down. Now, this is a bad thing. Oh, look, racism running rampant throughout, the South, I believe, was where most of them were, but there was other places too. But the majority were, I think, the South. Somebody following up on the story said, wait a second, just as many white churches have been burnt down. And in these cases of the black churches being burnt down, according to witnesses and whatever data we have, most of the suspects were black. So this isn't the racial issue that it was being made out to be by the mainstream media. And suddenly, churches burning down just wasn't an issue anymore. When we got proof that, this is not a racial issue, or we have reason to believe it's not a racial issue, all of a sudden the mainstream media doesn't care about it anymore. Because racism is a good story, church burnings aren't. That's giving them the benefit of the doubt. To not give them the benefit of the doubt would be to say they were actively trying to promote that racism is more rampant than it is. Then we have, of course, cops shooting black people. Same thing happened. People came out and said, look, cops shoot just as many white people as black people. And statistics to prove it. This one was a little slower to catch on. People were saying that. And then, Matt Walsh, I don't always agree with him, but he did point out an interesting fact that Black Lives Matter, one of the things they insisted on was that cops start wearing body cams. So cops started wearing body cams, and we started seeing all these situations. Why did the cop shoot him? There's no way someone would attack a cop. He had a knife, the cop had a gun. You wouldn't attack the cop under those circumstances. Yeah, people were attacking the cops under these weird circumstances where they had no good chance of surviving. It wasn't just, shoot him. It was, he's attacking me, I'm defending myself. In some cases, they tried tasers and the tasers didn't work. And so then they used their regular sidearm. It's, Matt Walsh has pointed out that the decision, the insistence that cops wear body cameras itself might have killed off Black Lives Matter, the organization, because their entire modus operandi has been to make accusations which there was no film to give an alternate explanation. Now there is. To the point where some of the mainstream media have started writing articles and doing segments on the news talking about how maybe police wearing body cams is making them more aggressive and they're actually encouraging these weird attacks so that they can... it's flipping the script, basically saying, look, this thing that, was supposed to be a good thing all along is actually causing the problem now, somehow. And so, like I said, it took a while, just pointing out that white people get shot by cops wasn't enough. Now we've got the video evidence to prove that some of these shootings are justified. The guy was stupid enough to charge the police officer with a knife. So now we have the militias. late 80s, early 90s, oh, these horrible white guys with guns. And so militia groups, and some of them were racist, most of them were not. So militia groups started inviting people in. Look, you want to see our operations? You know, we have nothing to hide. We have a right to meet together and to discuss politics and to train as if we might have to defend ourselves. You know, there are, and they'd invite the media in. And funny thing happened was that there were black militia members. In fact, some of the officers in these militia groups were black. So this narrative that the media was putting forward was wrong, and rather than stepping forward and saying it's wrong, our claims of racism were wrong, they just dropped the issue. Like, church burnings was no longer important, militias were no longer important because it's no longer racist. So I would say to some extent, the media is guilty of systemic racism. And again, I will argue, some of it is racism just makes for a better story. But on the other side, I think some journalists are looking for racism wherever they can find it because it's job security. It's a better story, so the more we find, the more job security you have when you report on it. And further, talking of the media, recently we had the stabbing of Irina Zarutska, which the question came up, why isn't this being covered? This exact same circumstance, person being stabbed on a subway would have been full coverage if it was a black person being stabbed. And rather than turning around and saying, yeah, we missed the story, we should have covered it better, it was MAGA Republicans are using this to try to foment racism. So again, it wasn't a matter of we just miscovered the story. It was a matter of we're going to turn this to promote more systemic racism. And when I say promote it, I don't mean that the MAGA Republicans are racist. I mean the media is racist. The only reason a white person would be concerned about a white woman being killed is because they are a racist. And so we're going to force that issue down people's throat, even though it's not what's really happening. Now, I will step out to Carlos Brown Jr. He told some of his friends before the stabbing took place that he thought he was being controlled. And after he was, after his friends came out and said this, he made a public statement, or a statement was made. He made a statement which was made public, I guess I should say, where he wanted to be checked over. Part of his defense is going to be he wants to be checked over for hidden devices inside his body. So I'd be willing to say he had some head problems. So he's not as guilty as people want to say he was. He should, we should be investigating whether or not he had mental issues, and possibly, rather than just put him in jail, get him the help he needs. But at the same time, he was heard supposedly saying, I got the white girl, which I've seen that tape. He's mumbling. I can't really understand him. Other people say he's saying that. So while we're getting him help, ask him why he said that. Because take a person who's having mental problems, bombard him with systemic racists telling him don't trust Whitey, and we shouldn't be surprised that he stabs someone and says, I've got the white girl. So he could still be innocent in all this. I know a lot of people aren't going to like my saying that, but he might have had actual mental problems, and being told reportedly by a system of racists that you can't trust white people could have driven him to do that. And I think getting to that is more important than actually finding him guilty. Now, before I leave, I will tell you on a happy note, Dorothy Jean Tillman, recently 17-year-old black girl, got her PhD, youngest person to get a PhD ever. Why aren't we hearing about that in the news? well, it's not a good racist story. We can't promote systemic racism against white people by saying, look, this black girl went to a mainly white institution and got a PhD younger than anyone else. That's not to say, oh, look how easily a black person get a PhD. Any teenager would have trouble getting a PhD at that age. But we just happen to have a case where the youngest person to get one happens to be one of the so-called oppressed minority, because systems of racists have told us they are oppressed minority more than any actual proof that we see. Because again, the average white person, it's not where, we ignore racism because we're racist and therefore we ignore it. It's a matter of we don't see it on a day-to-day basis. I will admit, a lot of what I'm saying is based on what I see as opposed to what what statistics or what people claim, their news stories, etc. Simply because it's hard to believe the problem's that bad when you don't see it as often. And when the people making arguments, white people are so racist, don't have their facts straight and are themselves being racist. So it's hard to agree with systemic racism, or the other alternative is to look at systemic racism as different systems, some of them white, some of them black, promoting racism. In which case, we have to acknowledge that both racists are a little guilty of this. The one thing I forgot to mention, you have to fight against systemic racism. How? I try not to be racist. I go to a job interview. Am I supposed to ask them, tell me, how many of your other applicants were black? I just want to make sure that you aren't hiring me over them because I'm white. A good human resource officer would not discuss the other applicants. And in fact, they would probably not hire me if I started asking such questions. So if I want a job, I've got to play the same game everyone else is expected to be playing and just not talk about the other applicants. And, to start questioning the race of other applicants, I'm not supposed to do it. They're not supposed to bring it up. I've never sat in an interview where, the person conducting it said, oh, we finally got a white person. I might walk out if I heard that. But never happened, and I've never in a good position to ask about the other applicants. So, which I shouldn't be doing. It would be racist of me to do so. That's it. Systemic racism, it does exist, it's bad. It is not the one big uber plot which conspiracy theorists would have you believe. It is actually several different systems of individual, groups of people of different races putting forward their own racist story of how things work. And they've all got their own agendas or whatever. So, yes, we should talk about systemic racism. We shouldn't talk about it as if it's this big uber plot by Whitey, because there are other people involved in it too. That's it. Have a nice day.